All right, hey everyone. I hope you don't mind Teddy being in the shot. I have to supervise him since otherwise he'll pee somewhere in the house. Um, but anyways, in this video, I wanted to talk about the father archetype, and in which I view as being of immense importance to human history, to the point where it's more obvious, I think, especially if you understand the patterns of history, to witness the kind of manifestations of this archetype. Um, in history more so than in mythology. Oftentimes, I use mythology as sort of the place where we find archetypes and we can see their influence. But it turns out that this archetype is very prevalent in history as well, and so one can do an entire historical analysis of this archetype in operation. Now, the father archetype isn't one that's specifically mentioned by Jung to any great extent. He did obviously talk about the father as being of immense, ideological importance in the development of the psyche, especially in the development of the psyche of the child. And of course, he describes the archetype the same way that his predecessors do, Erich Neumann and Anthony Stevens. He just never refers to it as the father archetype, as far as I could tell. And so I'm drawing largely from Anthony Stevens and Erich Neumann, who actually refer to a specific father archetype. But like I said before, this seems to be one of the more influential archetypes in history. And of course, it does have a great influence in the life of the individual, both from sort of the father figures you experience, and also your own psyche. Obviously, archetypes are meant to be projected outwards. That's kind of the point. The main function of the anima and the animus is to project it upon a particular individual to whom you form a relationship with. That's its primary function. So it's supposed to be projected outwards. But the archetype also operates at the individual level inside your own mind. And there's a great, I did something of a study on this where I tried to see whether the conscious ego itself is viewed by the unconscious mind as almost like this father figure. But of course, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. But so the archetype itself is one which is quite well known amongst ethologists, who are people who study animal behavior, and it's very prevalent in nature. And basically, every social animal has some variant of this archetype. And of course, by archetype, I really just mean the instinct, which we observe in nature. The archetype, like I said before, can be thought of as the subjective feeling of an instinct. So an instinct is kind of behavioral. What's wrong? The instinct is kind of behavioral. You can observe it, but the subjective feeling is subjective. You can't necessarily directly observe it. You can only sort of observe its influence. And biologists refer to this behavioral mechanism as the subordinance-dominance relationship. And so calling it the father archetype is a bit misleading. It does make sense to call this the father archetype in human societies, since the father fulfills the archetype usually in the personal relationship. Okay, I'm gonna go put Teddy somewhere. Sorry he couldn't stay for the whole video. He's getting annoying. But again, like I said, the father fulfills this role usually in the family, and since humans live in family units, it makes sense to call this the father archetype. But in nature, it's more general, where we call it the subordinate dominance relationship, and it allows a group of animals to act as a single unit, which is really interesting because it kind of blurs the lines between the individual and the group. It's almost as though a group of animals, like a group of geese or a group of wolves, are able to act with a single mind. And so they act almost like a single entity, which is really interesting in my opinion. So how this works is through the principle of rank, which I've described before, but which is essentially the fact that every animal in a group receives a rank relative to the other animals, usually based on size, usually based on age, where they're able to displace animals who are lower down on the rank. And so animals who are submissive, those who are lower on the ranking, act in a way which is more passive towards those who are dominant. So they'll often, wolves will often lower their heads. They will often follow those rather than be followed by those who are dominant to them. And every social animal receives a rank. Now, in most species, this is usually a male because males are often bigger. There are exceptions, such as elephant groups, who are often led by an older female, and bonobos, who are also, more matriarchal. But the general pattern is that males are the ones who are the leaders, or the sort of dominant individuals, and so hence why the archetype is referred to as the father archetype, and why the masculine sort of side of this whole spectrum is the thing which becomes emphasized in human societies, because humans are also like that, where the males are larger and hence sort of seen as the more dominant. Now, the reason, this sounds kind of authoritarian because, not everybody is free to act however they want. Everybody seems to be controlled by these dominant individuals, especially whoever's at the top. But there's actually a very good reason for this, because it allows the group to stay together and sort of act as a cohesive unit. Because essentially, whoever's the dominant individual is the one who makes all of the important decisions. He decides where to go, when to hunt, when to go forward for food, when to go get water, when to leave a certain area. That dominant individual is the one who makes those decisions, and so the group can kind of they work together because there's one person at the head who is making all the important decisions, and people aren't conflicting with different ideas and trying to go in different directions, which again allows the group to act as one cohesive unit. And so that archetype, what's actually happening is that there's something in us, there's some instinctual foundation which wants us to obey those who we see as dominant to us. There's something that's completely okay with this fact, the fact that there are dominant individuals, and we're okay giving up a certain proportion of our psychic functioning to these dominant individuals. It seems like a certain amount of our psyche is projected onto these individuals, and we allow them to make the decisions for us, with the assumption that they are more capable than ourselves. And of course, this includes the kind of the instinct to act passive in their presence. So I'll show you this clip here, which shows. Which is one of my favorite clips because it actually shows what I'm talking about. And it's also it seems like an amazing experience for this man. But as you see, what happens is the silverback, he decides to just leave, that it's time to go, and then everybody in the group just immediately follows him. And that's exactly what I'm talking about, because you often don't see this in nature documentaries. But this is how social animals operate. There's one person at the top, and where they go, the group goes. And so this individual forms the kind of the nucleus of the group, the head of the group. And I made some videos before demonstrating how the idea of something like a god is just this principle being carried to a sort of metaphysical idea. So where the dominant individual is an actual living being, it's now being transformed into a spiritual, metaphysical being who you don't actually perceive, but you feel to be always there. Now we can get to the kind of biochemistry behind what's going on here, because I find it really fascinating. And again, when we talk about something like psychology, especially Jungian psychology, is based entirely on the psyche. That's one of the fundamental postulates of analytical psychology, is that it studies the psyche directly. It's not interested in how the brain works and how neurons work. Obviously all of that is very important for the psyche, but Jungian psychology studies the psyche specifically, the manifestation of all of these sort of chemical interactions. It studies that as though it were an actual thing. Jung often said that he regards the psyche as real. But of course, we can always get into the neurochemistry, because I find that this will sort of help explain what's going on. And one of the things which goes on in sort of the dominant subordinate relationship is the neurotransmitter serotonin. Now, serotonin has multiple functions in the body, but one of its functions in the brain specifically is it allows kind of different areas of the brain to communicate more seamlessly, and so the brain becomes better able to communicate between different farther regions. And less serotonin in the brain kind of restricts your ability to think, and sort of these different brain regions become disconnected. And what we find is that dominant individuals tend to have more serotonin in their brains, which makes a lot of sense, because these are the individuals who are making all the key important decisions. It makes sense for them to be able to use more of their brain, whereas less dominant individuals, you don't want them to be able to make free decisions on their own. So their brains are basically more restricted by the fact that they have less serotonin. And this kind of, again, this is what allows the social cohesion of a group, and sort of the ability of the group to act as a single individual, as a single entity. Now, this principle extends to human societies, as you could probably tell. We also have leaders. We also have those who we perceive as dominant to us in our personal lives, and sort of at the level of entire societies. We have our political leaders who act in this manner, who are basically just these dominant individuals, but in a different kind of context, you could say. And so we really haven't changed much from our sort of biological origins. We're still doing the same thing that we used to do. I imagine aliens studying us and then watching like different political leaders try to seize lands or seize land from other countries, and then just being like, oh yeah, those are monkeys just being monkeys doing what monkeys do, like that. Would they see a difference between us and baboons? I don't think they would, because we're basically doing the same thing that we did as baboons, just with more technology. So the reason, again, like I said before, the reason it's called the father archetype is that the father usually fulfills this role in the early life of the child. Not always, because sometimes you don't grow up with a father, or your father doesn't fulfill this role and is more nurturing, and so sometimes your mother fulfills this role, or an older sibling or something. There's always somebody who's kind of guiding and controlling your behavior. I mean, that's an important feature as well that I forgot to mention, is that controlling behavior is very sort of vital to the operation of the father archetype. It attempts to control the behavior of individuals who aren't itself. Dominant individuals attempt to control the behavior of those around them. Now, of course, authority changes how you act and feel. You could probably relate to this if you think of somebody like your teacher when you were in school, or your boss at work. You feel kind of compelled to obey what they say. Now, there's also another psychological tendency acting at the same time that this acts. So there's one tendency that's like compel to obey those who are authority, who we perceive as dominant to us. But there's also this other tendency that wants us to be free, and that kind of wants us to be the dominant individual. And so these two counter tendencies kind of fight against each other in our psyches. The goal of this other tendency is so that you become the dominant individual, with the presumption that you become the dominant individual. Every animal seeks to be more dominant, which makes sense, because if you're the dominant individual, back when we were monkeys, it implies that you have all the opportunities of food, you have all the opportunities for breeding opportunities, and so obviously being the dominant individual is very attractive. But again, in the presence of those who we perceive as authoritative, we tend to be more passive. We tend to just listen to what they say. We perceive policemen, for example, as being dominant to us, and so that's why we're compelled to obey their orders and stuff. Now, again, the whole point is to restrict behavior. And in fact, this is the way society functions. Society functions by this principle of authority stemming from the tops of the government all the way down, it being imposed upon us to control our behaviors. The laws control what we do, and because we're being controlled in this very restrictive way, society is able to function. We don't have a society unless there are dominant individuals who are controlling our behavior. It's just not possible, because then everybody just acts according to their instincts, and then we all just act crazy. But of course, if our instincts are to an extent controlled by those who we perceive to be superior to us, it allows us to go beyond merely our instincts. A good example of this would be the fact that your parents, tell you to study, and they tell you to study really hard. Obviously, there's nothing instinctual about studying, about doing your homework. But of course, by doing so, you kind of become more educated, you become smarter, and then your opportunities increase. And so by imposing these restrictions upon your behavior, it allows the human to become more than human, so to speak. What I was saying before is the fact that human societies have metaphysically extended the principle of dominance. So for example, in gorillas, the dominant individual's influence can only be felt when the dominant individual is actually present. So like you can pretty much get away with what you want as long as that dominant individual is not there to control your behavior. But the second he shows up, you kind of you start to act in a more passive manner. But human societies were able to extend this principle metaphysically with the idea of like things like gods. By the fact that our brains developed in a way which allowed us to perceive things or think about things which weren't actually there. And so God is kind of an extension of this idea. We'll think of it in a society like ancient Egypt. The pharaoh is the dominant individual in ancient Egypt. He's the one who sets the laws, and society is effectively under his control. And how he does this is that not everybody needs to see the pharaoh, but they believe that the pharaoh is kind of always there watching them. And so their behavior is being controlled even though the pharaoh isn't directly there to control it. They just kind of feel this control emanating from the pharaoh and emanating from the gods. And so that's how society, religion is highly connected with the sort of development of civilization in the first, when it was first developing. And this is how it was able to do that. The idea of gods can be seen as these dominant individuals who control our behavior without actually, necessarily existing. And that's how humans were able to become like this. We weren't always like this, but because of religion and because of of gods, and because of the extension of the father principle, of the father archetype, this is what we've become. We've become far more than merely our sort of what our biological genetic constitution wants us to be. We've become, like this. In tribal societies, this is obviously very important because we want to be able to get the kids to help around and to help with hunting. And so you have to really, an authoritative figure really has to force the kid to do that. And of course the kid is compelled to obey the father figure because children in general learn by imitation. We see what our parents do and we imitate the same behavior. And so there's one kind of aspect of us which is okay with with obeying authority figures, but there's another aspect which doesn't really want to, and so we have to be forced. Usually our parents will use kind of aggression or the threat of punishment to be able to force us to do things, obviously to our benefit and obviously to the group's benefit. But of course originally when we're kids we don't feel like doing any of these things. So the king or the tribal leader is again an extension of this principle where, especially something like a king, because the kings pass down their authority to their children. And in chimpanzee societies, whoever the dominant individual is always changing because they're always getting displaced by somebody who's able to fight and take that position. But something like a king, it's just kind of like this because it's metaphysical, it passes down through their lineage, and so you're kind of compelled to obey them. And again, they're the dominant individual of an entire society, and so this principle is being extended further and further, and it'll continue to be extended further and further as single individuals are able to rule huge swaths of land and control huge numbers of people, and their word becomes the law, and you have to do what they say, and if you don't, there are certain consequences. And so you can see how the idea of a dictator, of an authoritative dictator, is really just an extension of the exact same principles which we had in biological evolution. At the biological level, there is a certain desire for us to follow leaders who we perceive to be as dependable, and or better at making decisions than us, because the average person usually isn't suited to the task, just because of the fact that being a leader in the modern world is such a difficult thing, and if you screw it up badly, and everybody notices. And so we are, there is nature kind of does have the assumption that whoever we're following is qualified for that position. But of course, in human societies, this isn't always the case, because somebody like Joseph Stalin clearly wasn't qualified to be a leader. He just did that. He was able to become a leader by basically mercilessly and ruthlessly climbing to the top. So a dictator is doing exactly what their kind of genetic primate ancestry is compelling them to do. But of course, something like a dictator imposes extreme levels of control upon people. And there's this ever-present feeling that something is hanging over you. You can think of the French Revolution with Robespierre. Anybody who was caught speaking, anti-revolutionary thoughts was immediately sent to the guillotine. And so you're always you're unable to speak your mind because there's always this kind of threat of something above you punishing you for not having the proper thoughts. It's exactly like Big Brother in 1984, exactly the same, and it exactly utilizes the father archetype, because again, the thing in primate societies which stops any individual from getting out of line is the presence of this authoritative figure sort of breathing down their neck. Well, something like 1984, Big Brother is always watching you. It feels like this authoritative presence is always watching you, and so you can't just be yourself because there's always somebody controlling your behavior because they're potentially watching you, and if you do something wrong, you could be punished. And there are some societies that impose extreme sort of levels of control upon people, such as currently in China, where this sort of social credit system is taking hold, where it's trying to mold people into model citizens, but in order to do so, it's constantly watching the people to make sure that they don't get out of line, which is crazy. And of course, you could say that this improves society, but at what cost? At the price of individual freedom. It's an immense sacrifice of individual freedom to sort of get these so-called societal benefits. And of course, there's a trade-off here. I don't want to merely say that one of these things is better than the other. Because too much individual freedom is just a society filled with chaos. But of course, too much societal order is just this authoritative, dictatorial society, and it's terrible, and there's no freedom. And there are two poles here, and it's not important not to think that, not to be extreme and to think one of these poles is necessarily better than the other. Obviously, the optimal society exists somewhere in between. So political leaders, and of course, this is where things get complicated because many political leaders are also women. But of course, just because they're women doesn't mean that they're not utilizing the father archetype. Again, the archetype it is related to masculinity, especially in humans, but it doesn't necessarily require a masculine individual to fulfill it. Especially since many women can utilize their masculine side in order to fulfill the archetype. Now, the thing about dictatorships is that it's very easy to think like, oh, everybody is against the dictator, but the history shows that in many dictatorial countries, and even today in countries like China, Russia, India, and Turkey, sorry if you're from those countries and are offended, but it does really seem like those countries are taking an authoritarian turn, and a substantial proportion of the population is completely okay with it. Now, why are they okay with it? Well, again, it's this archetypal predisposition to not want to be your own individual and instead sacrifice a certain degree of your psychic functioning and give that over to somebody who you perceive as a savior figure who's going to save the country. And so you give up your individual freedom in order to fulfill this belief that another individual will be your savior, which is very dumb in my opinion, because very often political leaders are just in it for themselves and don't really care that much. I mean, obviously, a political leader has to be able to provide their people with something. But of course, they usually do that with the goal of furthering their own power. And so, with propaganda and through conditioning, the members of a society become obedient, and they begin to view this political leader. They're okay with the fact that this political leader is taking away so much of their freedom, because they're willing to give up their freedom for this feeling of kind of security. Which doesn't come from themselves. And it's the exact same reason that a troop of chimpanzees is willing to follow a good leader, is because leaders in general are able to take society further. And ineffective leaders can be catastrophic. Now, such individuals, as these dictators and leaders often are usually themselves highly individuated people. They need to have very strong egos in order to make difficult calls and not to hesitate, and kind of get dirty when it needs to be done. And so there's a high degree of willingness on the part of the people to sort of give up their freedom for these political leaders to operate. And the stupid thing here is that, and this keeps happening, and it's still happening today, is that we often mistake a good leader with somebody who's just a very charismatic speaker and has a charming personality. We often think that these two things are related, that a conscientious leader is the same thing as somebody who's a good speaker, but usually not. Not at all, actually. Now, as I mentioned before, although there is something in us which wants to obey these authoritative figures, there's something in us which wants freedom, which doesn't want to just be restricted all the time and have to be forced to abide somebody else's will. There's something in us which wants to be independent, which wants to go our own way. And that independence results from our own ego and our own desire to kind of be the dominant individual. And so this kind of gives rise to the killing of the father motif in mythology, a very common motif. The most famous example today would be the battle between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. This represents, the literal fight against the father, because Darth Vader is this tyrannical figure who rules over the galaxy. I guess technically Palpatine is, but the father, the archetype is still there. And of course, Luke is this person trying to bring freedom. He's the son who wants to get sort of wrest control from this authoritative presence. And this archetype exists within every single person. We also feel the desire to sort of lift the boundaries of authoritative figures and the kind of control that they impose upon us, and in order to be our own individuals. And we all desire freedom, and we all desire the freedom to live without authority figures breathing down our necks. Human societies, and even you can argue, primitive societies, were very lacking in freedom. We weren't free for most of human societies, and we obviously aren't free today, but we're more free, I guess, in the modern West than we were, 100 years ago or 200 years ago, where we were where like kings would impose absolute control, and you could not say the wrong thing, or else you would be put in prison. Nowadays, we have freedom of speech, and obviously we're not free in every single way. But I often see people today who think that we live in the worst society today possible. That like this is the most authoritative society that's ever existed, and that's completely false, because you want to like compare what we have today to the past. Today's much better. Obviously not perfect, and obviously the more freedom we have, the better off we feel. And sort of the goal of society is to balance the society with individual freedom. And I think we've been going in that direction. Although we obviously slide back sometimes, and I think we are on the verge of a sliding back in the West. And of course, this desire to be free manifests at different levels. The kind of first level it manifests as is the family situation, where you feel like your parents are imposing these restrictions on you. They want you to go to bed at a certain time. They want you to eat certain foods. And yet you feel this desire not to do that, to be free and to explore other possibilities. And so you often rebel against your parents. And you go against their wishes. This is the first manifestation of that archetype. But of course, it manifests on larger degrees because the father principle also operates on larger degrees. A political leader isn't your actual father, but they are operating with the father archetype. And in a similar way, rebellions that kind of rise up against these figures are also an extension of this principle. And that's what I'm trying to convey. The fact that this archetype is so prevalent in history, because it kind of operates at different levels. And history is characterized by father figures rising up and then being toppled by their respective sons. They're not actually their sons. What I mean is that sort of the people who are being controlled by these father figures finally have enough of it and decide to rebel against it. And with the attempt of displacing that father figure and imposing a new order. And the number of examples of this popping up in history are too many. There are way too many to even name. Let's go with the Arab Spring, because that's the one apparently I wrote down. But you can imagine the Arab Spring of 2011 as something like this, because you have all of these dictators that rule these countries, and then suddenly people are sick of it. Suddenly people don't want to be controlled by these one-man dictatorships, and so try to rebel against that and try to gain their freedom. And what happens? Well, they're cracked down upon. Usually these authoritative figures attempt to squeeze and attempt to stop any sort of subversion. They want to control the people, and they do so through violence. But of course, you have the extremes of this pole, where the authoritative leader is overthrown, but then all you have is chaos. Which is what happened in Libya, which you could argue is happening in Libya, because the dictator Gaddafi was thrown down, but now we have multiple people trying to contend for the position of dictator, and so you didn't really get freedom, you just got chaos. And that's what arguably freedom is, because authoritative leaders, even though they suck, do often impose order and societal order, and even you could argue that that's not necessarily a good thing, but would you argue that chaos and civil war is also a good thing? It really depends. And, these things aren't clear cut. There isn't a clear path forward. And again, every revolution is of this nature, where people who feel this authority is getting too strong and imposing too much control over them, they feel like breaking out of the system, and so they attempt to impose their own order by fighting in a rebellion against this old system. And very rarely does this work. Most of the time it fails. Most of the time, every attempted rebellion, such as the Peasants' Rebellion in ancient China, they completely fail, because usually the authoritative figure has a better army, has better trained soldiers, is better able to pay them, and so they're more motivated. And so most attempts to overthrow the father, so to speak, completely fail in history. But of course, sometimes it succeeds, such as in the French Revolution, and the Russian Revolution, and the American Revolution. Now, only one of these examples would I see as a positive development at the time. The French Revolution, ended in another dictatorship. And there's an important thing I want to make clear here, is that it's not necessarily overthrowing the father archetype for the sake of getting freedom. It's overthrowing the father archetype for the sake of getting perceived freedom. So, or the life you perceive as being better than the alternative. So, for example, the Russian Revolution tried to replace, the Russian monarchy with communism. At least that was Vladimir Lenin's goal. And of course, this isn't replacing authority with freedom. It's replacing authority with another authority. It's just that in Lenin's mind, the second authority was better and needed to sort of replace the old authority. And so, of course, there's no necessary correlation between overthrowing the father and getting more freedom. In fact, oftentimes you get less freedom, such as in the French Revolution. Things became significantly more dictatorial. both under Robespierre and then against and then in subsequent regimes, and then against under Napoleon, who was an extreme dictator and imposed extreme order upon French society. But fundamentally, this is the struggle for self-determination. And examples like the American Revolution are at least, they seem to be an example where an authority was overthrown and more freedom was granted to the people. This, in certain ways that's true, and in certain ways it's not. For example, probably wasn't true for slaves. But the point still remains is that at the sort of societal level, at the collective level, at the level of the nation, those who feel oppressed will inevitably fight against the authority which oppresses them. All attempted revolutions are of this nature, and very often the dictator, the person who's in control, will attempt to crack down. And that's happening today. You see protests all over the world. For example, in Hong Kong, Hong Kongers want freedom from the Chinese government, and so they try to get it through protesting. But at the same time, the Chinese Communist Party cracks down on them and then imposes even greater order, and so things ended up even worse for them, which is very unfortunate. But of course, this is the pattern of history, and it's very scary. It's honestly something that terrifies me, the idea of attempting to overthrow a great power, because sometimes it's necessary. We don't want these great powers over us. But of course, those great powers often go to extreme lengths in order to preserve the authority that they already possess. And I want to just name some more examples because I just want to make it clear how common this is. So, for example, the Catalan movement in Spain. Catalonia is a region of Spain which is under the control of the Spanish government, but feels itself to be independent. And obviously, they don't want to be controlled by these people, and so they try to get some degree of autonomy. There was a rebellion so I live in Canada, and Quebec is a French-speaking part of Canada, and there was this group called the FLQ which tried to gain more autonomy for France, and that can be seen as the exact same thing. They feel like this authoritative presence which hangs over them doesn't accurately reflect the kind of society they want to live in, and so attempt to displace it in some way. The examples of myriad. Every protest is like this. Every revolution is like this. Every rebellion is like this. And most of the time they fail. Only once in a while do they succeed, and oftentimes they don't succeed for the better. Like, I don't think anybody would argue that communist Russia or the Soviet Union was better than the Russian monarchy. Absolutely not. Or at least absolutely not for a while. At a point it did get better. Because that monarchy also did suck. But I am painting kind of a grim picture here. Like, I'm painting, maybe you shouldn't rebel against the authority. The only way society changes is through this process, and obviously there are examples of it being peaceful, where we're able to change the kind of way society is structured peacefully. And obviously that's the ideal situation. But sometimes that's not possible. And society does make great leaps and sort of great changes through the process of displacing the old authority, because the old authority, usually wants to preserve the way things used to be, and or sort of imposes their own kind of way of seeing things. And so society becomes really restricted, and it becomes impossible to grow, because any kind of divergence from the norm is seen as a threat to the old structure and is immediately destroyed. But of course, in order for society to grow, in order for things to change, in order for revolutions to happen, this kind of change needs to occur, and the old order does need to be displaced if we want things to change. There might be a point where we get like a society that's so good that we don't want it to change for a while, and that's fine. But I think inevitably it reaches a point where people want things to change and we want things to be better, and so we attempt to displace the old order in order to impose the new order, which is ideally better, although as history again reveals, it isn't always better. And there are many examples of the new order being worse than the old order. But yeah, like I said before, this is what gives rise to the killing of the father motif, the most common motif, or one of the most common motifs in mythology, because it's again this feeling of wanting to get rid of the thing which imposes order upon you. And of course the father is the grand symbol of this, because the father is the first person to impose this order. And so we often see the father being killed. For example, Zeus's father was killed by him. Because the father is a good symbol to kind of represent this phenomenon, the phenomenon of having, of displacing an authoritative presence. But yeah, so that's all I wanted to say about that. That ended up being a lot faster than than I thought, but hopefully you get an idea of why I consider the father archetype to be the most influential in history, and why it's such a big deal, and why it kind of influences you at the personal level and at the collective level. This video is more focused on the collective level, but of course the father archetype does operate at the personal level, obviously, because you have your own sort of personal father figures. And of course, again, I don't want to, you may have taken as a final note from this that a very negative idea of the father archetype, but very often the father is an actual good presence on the, a good influence on the child, because the child does need some kind of structure in its life, and if it doesn't have that structure, it just kind of falls into chaos. But if you do have this authority over you, it can be a positive influence, especially if you have somebody to kind of imitate. We often learn by imitating people who we perceive, or people who we admire, and of course that's also the father archetype in operation. The man of personality, so to speak. And that's obviously a good thing, because you do want to it kind of helps you develop your own psyche. But at a point, you do decide to go your own way and become your own individual. And of course, that's when we begin to perceive these father figures in a negative light. And so, these are very complicated things. They go in different directions. There isn't one clear solution. It's not like, yeah, you need to fight against the father, or you need to imitate your father and obey authority figures. It's obviously a combination of both of these, and they kind of come into operation at different times in a person's life, and at different times in history as well. And so I want to, one of the things I really want to make clear with everything I say is that these things are very complicated. There's no clear-cut solution, and there's no clear-cut path that we should take. But anyways, I hope you learned from this, and I hope you enjoyed me talking and ranting. But yeah, hope you enjoyed. Take care. Bye-bye.